Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. Republicans have been scoring a lot of cheap political points on Obamacare lately because, let's face it, healthcare.gov has made it easy to do. When, for example, your website doesn't work, you leave yourselves open to attack. But Obamacare also provides a convenient scapegoat to blame for all sorts of economic ills that either pre-existed or just have nothing to do with the healthcare law. Thanks to a new jobs report today, delayed by the government shutdown, tonight we have facts. And one bit of data in particular that might finally put one of the most insidious lies out of its misery, that Obamacare is a job killer.
Larry, you say blame the health care law for the surge in part-time workers?
Welcome to part-time nation. Not something we want to be proud of.
Obamacare is causing a rise in part-time employment.
In order to comply with this law, they're having to put people on part-time to save their companies.
You hear it everywhere.
And there is a shift in hiring patterns because Obamacare is coming.
It's a talking point repeated by pundits of all stripes.
We can already see the rise of part-time labor.
We are becoming something of a part-time employment country.
Fox News.
We've also cut back on hiring full-time employees.
And by Republican politicians ad nauseum.
Just when we need a full-bore, full-time economy, America is becoming a part-time economy. These are the effects of Obamacare.
Obamacare is a big reason we're turning into a nation of part-time workers.
Because of Obamacare, millions of full-time workers can only find part-time work.
And we're seeing our economy turn from a full-time job economy into a part-time job economy.
We do not want a part-time working America.
A part-time economy, part-time opportunities.
People were being forced from full-time work to part-time work.
We're becoming part-time America because of this law.
It is forcing people to go from full-time work to part-time work.
Obamacare is hurting millions of people. It's killing their jobs. It's forcing them into part-time work. It's
more and more people into part-time.
Forced into part-time work. For all the people out of a job, all the people in part-time work, losing their jobs, being pushed into part-time work. Who are losing their jobs, who are being pushed into part-time work, and they're losing their jobs. They're forced into part-time work.
But luckily, we don't have to rely on politicians, pundits, and anecdotes to tell us what's going on in the economy. We also have data. Today we learned full-time employment is up, and the number of people working part-time involuntarily is down since June, and down even more since last year when Obamacare wasn't a factor. In other words, the trend is moving in the opposite direction of the talking point. And when you zoom out a couple of years, since the start of the financial crisis, you see the rise in part-time work starts after the crash and has since gone down, in part while Obamacare has been the law of the land. That shocked economists like Mark Zandi of Moody's Analytics, who thought we were going to see a rise in part-time work because of Obamacare.
Earlier in the year, looking at the ADP data, looking at job creation around that 50-employee threshold, it felt like to me healthcare reform was having an impact. But by the summertime, that all disappeared, and job growth among those size companies is back to,
What, you get a phone call?
But now Zandi admits that the president's health care law is not leading to increased part-time work.
I've expected it. I really have. I just haven't seen it.
The Los Angeles Times today says today's job numbers puts the lie to the popular conservative meme that Obamacare has transformed America's workforce into part-timers. PolitiFact today, government numbers actually show that the fraction of part-timers in the workforce has declined since 2010. And the Wall Street Journal today finds that a closer look at the data provides little evidence for the notion that the health law is driving a shift to part-time work. And yet, the zombie talking point of part-time employment persists because Obamacare has become the easy scapegoat for people to blame for things that were already happening in the economy.
How can you say Obamacare isn't in part to blame for more part-timers?
We look at the data. When we hear anecdotes, we respond to that. But when you look at the aggregate data, it rather overwhelmingly demonstrates that, again, this is a nice talking point, but it's just not accurate. And it's part of the confusion campaign that folks are waging.
Joining me now is Congresswoman Karen Bass, Democrat from California. And Congresswoman, now that we have the BLS data, we'll get some more data in a few weeks, do you expect you just won't hear this anymore because the data just shows it isn't true?
You know what? I wish I could say that, but I do think that my Republican colleagues have showed consistently that data doesn't really change their talking points. This has been a multi-million-dollar campaign of confusion and deception, and I'm sure you've seen they're even marketing books that contribute to the confusion around health care reform.
One of the things I think that's happened with the health care law is something that also happens with the debt and deficit, which is that people attach it to their economic anxiety about a labor market that's not functioning very well in the broadest sense. And so what you get is people feel like the labor market isn't functioning. They are right to feel that way, and then they tag Obamacare as the culprit.
Right, and I definitely think they're right to feel that way. Can you imagine if Congress had been functional and we had passed the Jobs Act, if we didn't shut down the government over the hysteria over health care reform? You know, our economy shouldn't be limping along in a recovery. It should be a robust recovery right now. And the only reason it isn't is because of the antics that go on here in Congress led by the Republicans.
There are also deeper factors in that, though, right? I mean, Congress has not helped things, but one of the things I think we're seeing is that the labor market was not really producing great gains for working people even before the financial crisis. There's long-term structural trends in the economy. The financial crisis broke the labor market, and now you hear this anecdotal stuff. I've heard it myself. Oh, I'm going down to part-time. And it's also, I think, become convenient for employers to point the finger at Obamacare for stuff that they wanted to do anyway.
Right. I think that's absolutely right. And it is important that we correct the deceptions, though, because, you know, just like the problems that are happening with the website, when you look at the states that have embraced health care reform, everybody's having little glitches, but the states that have embraced it are doing very well. And I think it's something that we have to be very strong in combating. So employers should not use this as an excuse to cut down their labor force.
Is there any way to sort of jiu-jitsu this around and basically start a conversation about job creation in the budget talks that are coming down the pike? I mean, the problem in the labor market is we have too many people out of work. I mean, and a lot of terrible things flow from that. Depressed wages, a bad labor market for people at the bottom of the scale, people just graduating from college, and yet there doesn't seem to be any kind of momentum in Congress towards doing anything on the jobs front that isn't essentially repealing Obamacare.
Well, right. And, you know, one of the things that all of us know has to be dealt with this time in the budget talks is a sequester, because we were told right when that went into effect that that was going to lead to tens of thousands of jobs lost. And so I think the sequester is one of the first things we need to deal with. And then maybe my colleagues learned something when the government shut down. Remember, they were kind of shocked when you shut down the government, things actually stop happening. Maybe they learned something about that. And so when we go to budget talks this time, dealing with the sequester needs to be at the top of the agenda.
Congresswoman, do you hear from business owners in your district, from constituents, some of these this anecdotal discussion of Obamacare being a job killer, or people being capped under 30 hours so that they don't qualify for the employer mandate, which I should note won't go into effect for another year?
Right.
Do you hear that? Is that something you interact with your constituents about?
Well, it is something that I interact with my constituents about, but it's primarily from the point of view of confusion. People just being confused because they hear what the Republicans put out there and that other network puts out there, and it's led to a lot of confusion. And so I'll tell you, one of the things that we've done in my district are telephone town halls. We're doing a town hall to sign people up, but especially in a state like California, there's no reason for some of this confusion except for the fact that millions of dollars have been put into a very deliberate campaign.
Congresswoman Karen Bass, thank you so much.
Thanks.
Joining me now, Josh Barrow, politics editor for Business Insider, and economist Dean Baker, co-director for the Center for Economic and Policy Research. And Dean, I was trying today to not make this a straw man, so I was looking for the best case argument that Obamacare was having a negative effect or is pushing people to part-time work. And the best thing I could find is a guy named by the name of Jed Graham at Investors Business Daily, who has been looking at the average hours worked of people down in the wage scale, making around $14, $15 an hour, and he says it's set a record low in July. If you look at the BLS data, it's about 20 minutes a week lower than it was before, but that's about the best I could find. Do you think, even if it's not having a macro effect, it might be having an effect among low-wage workers?
I think it's almost inconceivable that's having a measurable effect. I mean, someone somewhere has had their hours cut. That's absolutely true. But my colleague Helena Jorgensen and I looked at the data on the percentage of the workforce that's working less than 30 hours a week, and we compared the first 6 months of 2013 with the first 6 months of 2012. It had actually fallen. Now, can you find subgroups somewhere that it's increased? You have to be able to. That's the way the world works. That's data. That's statistics. But the idea that this has had noticeable effect, that just doesn't make any sense.
Josh, do you think this talking point is running out of steam as the data comes in? Because I think a year or 2 years ago, it was a reasonable hypothesis to say there might be this unintended consequence. You've got an employer mandate. It creates a hard threshold of 30 hours. Let's run the experiment. Maybe it's going to happen.
I think it was never a reasonable hypothesis because the set of people in the labor market likely to be affected by this is pretty small. You have to have been working more than 30 hours a week. You have to not be getting health insurance from your employer. And you probably have to be a pretty low-wage worker because this $2,000 penalty, that's the reason that employers might move people to part-time work. There's a penalty if you have a full-time employee who you don't give health insurance to. Right. If you have a high-wage worker who for some reason isn't insured, that $2,000 probably doesn't make you want to cut their hours. So there aren't that many of these kind of people in the economy. If you look at Jed Graham's numbers and you take the most generous possible interpretation of them, it suggests that maybe you've had about 100,000 people who've been pushed down into part-time work from full-time work. There are 150 million people in the U.S. labor force, so that means about 1 out of every 1,500 workers has had their hours cut. But I'd note this is about a penalty that's not going to be in effect for another 14 months. So I think you could see some measurable effects from this. I don't think we're ever going to see millions of Americans pushed down into part-time work like Ted Cruz is saying, but hundreds of thousands, maybe. What's a small but meaningful effect.
1 out of 1,500 is a smaller percentage than the amount of times it has been invoked in the debate. I mean, that's what's so crazy. This thing is everywhere, and we had our incredible producers and tape editors who are searching through this today, and as you can tell from the package, they found a gold mine because it is said all the time. And it's one of these things, Dean, it's one of these facts that becomes true through repetition that I have heard said back to me by people at barbecues, at diners, in bars. These are not ideologues. These are people who said, well, my cousin got his hours cut because of Obamacare. It is definitely out there.
Chris, we looked at this because my mother, who's a big fan of yours and MSNBC in general, assured me that this was happening because, you know, she went down to a movie theater and they were cutting everyone's hours to less than. So I arranged to do this with Helena Jorgensen, my colleague, and we saw, no, it's not showing up in the data.
It's the rare son that fact-checks his mother on national television.
She'll get me for that.
So here's the deeper question. I think this worry about part-time work is a convenient way of focusing people's anxiety about a job market that every month we get jobs numbers that are screaming out, policymakers, hello, the job market is broken.
Sure. I mean, and the public is not very good at looking at the economy and figuring out what the drivers
not their job to.
So I think you're right that Republicans have latched onto this, but I think there's also an opportunity here for liberals that was missed. When you imposed this employer mandate in Obamacare, the idea was to get employers to take on their responsibility to provide health insurance.
Let me just quickly say, the employer mandate, so people are clear, because there's two different mandates flowing around. There's an employer mandate in the law that says if you have above 50 employees, you have to provide health insurance to your full-time employees or pay a penalty.
Right. So if you didn't have that penalty, you probably would get a lot of employers dropping health coverage, especially for low-wage workers, and telling them to go buy in the exchanges. And you're seeing some of this with part-time workers, like Trader Joe's is getting rid of its health coverage for people who work less than 30 hours. It's giving them a payment of about $500, and what a lot of those workers are finding is that it's cheaper for them to go buy exchange coverage than it was for them to make their employee contribution toward the health plan they got from Trader Joe's before. This is effectively a wage subsidy for low-wage workers, and we might want more employers.
Dean, what were you going to say?
I was just saying that has nothing to do with the sanction because these are workers that put in less than 30 hours a week.
That's exactly right. And in fact, one of the things that I think if the law is to be successful, right, more people might be moving into that exchange if it gets active and competitive and robust.
Right, and if we didn't have the sanction on employers for full-time work, I think, not only would these small effects that we might see with people getting pushed down to part-time work, that would not be an issue. You might actually see a real increase in wages for those low-wage full-time workers. So I think when we're looking for something to deal with the fact that we have a bad labor market, especially at the bottom end, getting rid of the employer mandate might be good for that for reasons other than the fact that it affects the unemployment rate.
Dean, what are you seeing in the numbers about the status of the labor market?
Well, it continues to be very weak. I mean, the latest data, you know, the 148,000 jobs a month, I mean, we weren't growing all that fast even, you know, if you go back to the first 6 months of the year, but we're looking at 170, 180,000. Now the last 3 months we're looking at 140, 150. You have to remember, we're in a hole. We're down 9 million jobs. We have to create 100,000 a month just to keep pace with the growth of the labor force. So if you're making that up at the rate of 40 or 50,000 a month, we're going to have this conversation like 2028 before we're back at full employment. That's not a good story.
Yeah, I would rather not. Josh Barrow from Business Insider and economist Dean Baker, thank you both. Coming up.